If you didn't already know it, Polestar and Volvo are in the middle of an amicable divorce. And that makes sense to me, because their mission has been different for a while, and it's diverging over time. Volvo is still obsessed with safety and family, whereas Polestar is obsessed with being the answer to the German performance brands like BMW and Porsche. And that's how we got here, the 2025 Polestar 3. This is Polestar's preemptive answer to the upcoming Porsche Cayenne EV. And if that sounds crazy to you, just wait till we get to the numbers, because this handles better than every other entry in its segment, except for the Macan EV and the upcoming Cayenne EV perhaps, but basically this outhandles the BMW and the Mercedes options that are competing very directly with this. And it does it with a little bit of Scandinavian flair and assembly right here in the US. First things first, is this a 2-row EX90 or is the EX90 a 3-row Polestar 3? The answer is yes to both. They were co-developed on the new SPA 2 platform, which is an evolution of the SPA platform we find under the XC90. So while Polestar and Volvo argue that this is a dedicated EV platform, there are certainly some structural holdovers from that not dedicated SPA 1 platform, and that's more noticeable on the inside than on the outside. Now, speaking of the outside, this definitely has a lot of Volvo still in the DNA. And refreshingly, Polestar does not run away from that. You talk to the Polestar people and they're like, yeah, you know, Polestar started out as a Volvo sub-brand, and there's still a lot of common DNA. They're not calling these Thor's hammer headlights, but if you park this next to an EX90 or an EX30, well, you know, the relationship is definitely there. I appreciate the fact that not every Polestar looks like one another. So this definitely does not look that much like a Polestar 2 in that we have this arrow wing here and we get more elegant headlights, but we still have this little bow tie thing going on down below. The Polestar 4, that looks different still, and then the Polestar 5, 6, and 7 coming soon will further differentiate themselves from the Volvo lineup. Now, versus the EX90, which is, again, closely related, we have a front end that is notably lower. And that's because they really wanted to give this that sleek, crossover, sedan, hatchback, wagon kind of look that seems to be very in at the moment, but we still have this really long hood design. The front wing is definitely a cool touch, but combined with the relatively low hood line, we don't have a lot of storage under here, even though we do have a front trunk. It has the same sort of magnetic lid that we find in the EX90, but because of the lower hood line, it doesn't have as much storage space underneath. I've always had a soft spot for station wagons, and that's probably why I like the side profile of the 3 so much. This long and low hood definitely accentuates that stretched wagon vibe. Currently, this adaptive air suspension is in its highest height mode. You'll get an air suspension in all dual motor models, a standard steel spring suspension in the base rear-wheel drive model at the moment. But oddly enough, it doesn't seem to have as much height as the European model Polestar 3 did when I drove it in Spain last year. All models are going to have staggered tires, and most models seem to come with summer tires. This one is a Pirelli P0 tire on this model, 295s in the back, 265s up front, nice big meaty brakes as well. If you get the rear-wheel drive model, you'll get an Aero 20-inch wheel with 285 with tires in the back, 255s up front, so still pretty chunky on the tire front. And that's because this weighs about 800 pounds more than a current generation gasoline Porsche Cayenne. And it's about the same size in terms of length. That's about 1.2 inches longer than this, and the roofline is a little bit taller and boxier as well. But this is 7 inches longer than the new Macan EV, and it's right in line with most of the competition, which would be Audi Q8 e-tron, EQE SUV, BMW iX, the Cadillac Lyriq, and of course the Tesla Model X. Yes, this is more X than Y, and remember, X comes standard with 2 rows, not 3. 3 are optional in that model. In addition to the wide rear tires, and from this angle you can see just how wide they really are, Polestar did something interesting with the rear electric motor. They gave it a twin-clutch torque vectoring mechanical differential. That's very different than we find in, say, an Audi SQ8. That uses a tri-motor setup in the back, 185 horsepower on each rear wheel. With this system, Polestar can send 245 horsepower to a single rear wheel. Now, they can't regenerate on one wheel and power the other wheel, but they can send significantly more power to a single rear wheel, and it can act like a locking differential. So if you're in snow, on mud, ice, etc., conditions you might find in Scandinavia, which is quite logical why Polestar is the one that cooked this up, this is going to be more sure-footed than the average tri-motor setup, and it's going to feel a little bit more traditional. Now, as far as design in the back, it looks exactly like you'd assume a performance electric wagon would look. Nice, slim LED taillight modules there, amber turn signal, really slim in the center. One weird thing though, if you're looking at the rear fog lights, there's only one and it's over there on the driver's side, but I appreciate the fact that they're really low on the bumper, not confusingly high where a brake light would be. We still have a rear windshield wiper, and we do have a spoiler that actually connects through the roofline there, so that helps improve the airflow coming out the back. Now let's talk about what's going on under the hood. First thing you'll notice, we have a small front trunk storage area. It has a magnetic lid, which is kind of a cool touch. It's about 1.5 cubic feet, so enough room for a gym bag if you remove the plastic divider, but basically just enough room for your fix-a-flat, your charge adapters, etc. There's a piece of common wisdom out there that's always made me laugh, and that is that if you have a dedicated brand new EV platform, you should have a big front trunk up front, and a bad front trunk is a hallmark of a converted platform design. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because in reality, the only way you'd have a lot of space up front for no particular reason is by sharing a lot of structural components with an ICE vehicle that was designed to have an engine live up front. And that's possibly what we see here, because if we look at the Polestar 4 and the other upcoming Polestars, we don't really have much of a front trunk because we have an even lower front end design and an even shorter hood profile. Further under there, we find a standard heat pump, and then further under there, we find the same electric motor that we have in the back, except that it doesn't have the twin clutch differential on it, so no torque vectoring up front. That's something I would love to see in a future performance version, just in case anybody is listening out there. Interestingly, if you get the single motor model, you don't get the twin clutch unit in the back, but you do get more power. 299 horsepower in the back, 361 pound-feet of torque total. That's going to get you the longest range figures in the lineup, between 333 and 350 miles of electric range. Keep in mind the really wide tires. That's all thanks to a big battery pack. This is a 111 kilowatt hour NMC pack with a usable capacity of about 107 kilowatt hours. That's around 10% larger than the battery we find in a Model S or a Model X. On the range figures, I would caution you that Polestar is not calculating range the same way as Tesla is. They're being a little bit more conservative, so that accounts for some of the difference. Now back to the dual motor model. Again, we get identical motors front and rear, but it lacks the torque vectoring unit. The torque vectoring unit in the rear is interesting because not only does it send power across the axle, it can also disconnect the axle. So this has the ability to drive along as a front-wheel drive EV, and it will do that on the highway. If you're driving 65, 75 miles an hour, it's going to be front-wheel drive. If you get off the exit and you start driving on a favorite winding mountain road, it's going to re-engage the rear axle and it's going to send most of the power to the rear axle. So it's definitely going to have a rear power bias. Then when you're regenerative braking, it's going to do most of that on the front axle because you get the greatest regen potential up here, and that's probably why this does not have that mechanical disconnect. We see something very similar in modern Rivians for the exact same reason. Now, if you get the performance pack, power does go up to 517 horsepower. This does not have that performance pack option on it, which is why this one has just over 300 miles of EPA range. Range is going to vary between 279 and 315 miles of range, depending on the options you select. Although on this trim, I think the range figure is a little bit optimistic thanks to the summer tires. Charging happens behind door number 6, where we find a CCS connector. Polestar has committed to the new NACS or J3400 standard, but we don't know when we're going to find that connector natively on the vehicles. However, Polestar does have access to the Tesla supercharger network right now, and that is going to be the most reliable way to DC fast charge your Polestar. And in fact, the navigation system seems to prefer taking you to Tesla stations for DC charging. In our testing, this went 31 minutes from 10% to 80%, so that's a pretty quick time. That's just 1 minute slower than Polestar's specification. I think that's because in order to hit the maximum 253 kilowatt charge rate of this vehicle, you do have to find a high current DC fast charge station. And most of the EA or EVgo stations out there cannot actually deliver 600 amps. Tesla stations can, but not apparently through the adapter on the Polestar 3 at the moment. So if you're in Europe, you're going to charge a little bit faster. If you're in North America, you're going to charge just a little bit slower. Front seat comfort is fantastic, easily 10 out of 10 points. We get a manually extending thigh cushion there, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, one of the best seat massages in the luxury segment, and a powered memory-linked tilt telescopic steering column. The seating position is a little bit more relaxed and more reclined than something like a Cayenne, but actually not too far off where we find the Macan EV. Unfortunately, there is the way you access the seat controls, and this is easily my least favorite seat control ever conceived of. We have one knob that's expected to do everything, and then one button in the middle. You have to press that button to cycle through the various things that the knob does, from lumbar to the inflatable side bolsters to the seat back adjustments, etc., and invariably it's in the wrong mode. We then have the fact that you don't have a control for the powered tilt telescopic steering column. You have to dig around on the software, press the button, and then use the buttons on the steering wheel to adjust the steering wheel. Good luck doing that safely while you're driving. I think I would have rather just had a manual steering column if they were going to go through all that fiddly business. Also, no memory settings on the doors. That's all tied with your profile in the software. On the other hand, we get a big, big back seat. Now, one of the weird things about the Polestar 3 is that Polestar doesn't have an official legroom number for North America, which is kind of weird. So we're going off of the European numbers, and I'm asking for clarification on that because when you sit back here, this is much more like a Cadillac Lyriq than it is some of the other smaller options that you might be thinking of. The front seat is adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. As you can see, I have about 7 or 8 inches of legroom left. This front seat is almost all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person sit there very comfortably. As you can see, I still have about 4.5 inches of legroom left. So the numbers on the side of your screen, they're probably not right. If you're looking for an EV that could very comfortably fit a large rear-facing child seat, this is going to be a fantastic option. It appears that versus the EX90, the second row has been moved a little bit further rearward, which is probably why we have this kind of odd bump right there under the seats. So if you're the kind of person that really likes to put your legs kind of underneath your knees, you should know that you can't do that in this. And that's just because some portion of the body, etc., is under there, and the wheelbase is a little bit shorter than some. But we do have a completely flat floor back here, air vents, and of course 3-zone climate control as well. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, flat with the cargo area in the back, and there's a ski pass-through in the middle seat. Not only do we have a lot of legroom, we also have a lot of extra width back here, and that is really obvious if you sit in this center seat position. This is again the kind of vehicle where you could definitely put some of those larger child seats, mix them up with adults or taller folks in the back quite easily. And headroom is pretty generous, even given the roofline. Behind the power hatch, we find 21.1 cubic feet of cargo capacity. If that seems small to you, remember that European car companies generally don't consider the storage area above the rear head restraints or below the floor, especially if it's not a dual stage load floor. So as far as storage goes, this is comparable with most of the competition, but you will find a few here and there with a slightly larger cargo area. I was able to squeeze 3 of our 24-inch roller bags back here, plus some additional luggage. And you can fit quite a lot under the floor. The load floor in the Polestar 3 is unusually shaped. As you can see, you could put an entire 22-inch roller bag under here, and if I pull that out, you'll notice it goes even deeper down. Really quite a deep storage area. It could be a little bit more efficient, if I'm honest, because if I pull this floor completely out, you'll notice we have a small amount of storage over here and kind of an unusual bump. That's because if I pull this out, we have some cables and a fuse box that I think could have been positioned a bit better. As we look around the interior together, keep in mind that this is not a base trim, but it's also not a fully loaded model. That'll become obvious in just a moment. Up here we have a button module for the telematics system, map lights, things like that, and a hazard light button, very similar to the button modules we find in modern Volvos. Also similar to modern Volvos, the swing to the side sun visors that are not wrapped in the same fabric as the headliner. These are instead more of a somewhat rubbery plastic. These are going to clean easier, so it's a very practical thing to do, but it doesn't feel as premium as the headliner. Now, speaking of the headliner, there's not a lot of it because we have a huge glass roof running right there over both rows of seats, just as you'd expect in a modern EV. Speakers up there in the headliner, that is a map light right there in the middle for the rear passengers. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, fixed in place head restraints. These head restraints feature perforations because there are also speakers in there. This has a ton of speakers with the optional Bowers & Wilkins sound system. This is one of the best sound systems I have ever heard in a modern EV. It is truly fantastic. Now down here you can see Polestar loves labeling things everywhere. So right here we have 100% traced Napa leather. This is real leather, it's not imitation leather. Polestar defends that by saying, hey, cows get killed anyway, so they might as well use the leather. And in some respects, that is going to be lower emissions than imitation leather. You can see we have kind of an interesting pattern to those perforations there. Instead of a Swedish flag like we find in Volvos, we have a little airbag indication right there. Then we have the adjustable side bolsters, the extending thigh cushion, as you can see. There are a bunch of different interior color options. Moving over to the doors, you'll notice that the style is a little bit different than modern Volvos. I would say maybe a little bit cooler, not quite cold, but definitely a different kind of modern theme. Lots of soft touch materials, as you'd expect, going all the way down the door, including the lower portion of the door that is made from a slush molded plastic. Moving over to the dashboard, the upper material, similar to the doors, this is kind of a wetsuit style material stitched together. We then have open pore real wood trim, big air vents, and the actual manual air vents at that, which is definitely my preference. Then soft touch materials all the way down the dashboard. The glove compartment, it's an electronic release. As you can see, it's a little on the small side. I would not be able to fit a tablet computer inside. But speaking of tablets, oh my, do we have a large one in the dashboard. It's a vertical orientation screen, which is different than we find in the Polestar 4, which uses a horizontal orientation screen. Honestly, I don't mind either look. I think this gives you more space to operate the air vents and a little bit more air vent, honestly, than we'd find in the big horizontal Polestar 4. But this software, it needs a lot of time in the oven. I would call it half-baked, but I'm not quite sure it's had that much time in the oven as it is. We've been driving this for about 700 miles or so, and I want to say that pretty much without fail on the road, every hour or so, the entire system will reboot. There are also a bunch of features missing. For instance, we don't have Apple CarPlay yet, even though that has been promised. We also have a bunch of other things that are not here yet either. So if I go to the apps and try and load the performance app, oops, it's not ready yet. So there's definitely a lot of software waiting to come. Well, Polestar has pushed performance upgrades that seemingly have improved the 0 to 60 performance of the car in the real world. They have not addressed some of those basic feature functions. And things like the phone as key feature, those don't work quite as I would like. I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but in a nutshell, lots of promise, not a lot of delivery just yet. Although, again, we have been seeing software updates. And I have to admit that Volvo and Polestar both have been pushing software updates on the Polestar 2, the EX30, C40, etc. over time. More of a fundamental complaint, I guess you could say, is that like we find in modern Teslas, lots of controls happen inside this software, and that's not going to change with software updates. So left mirror, right mirror, and then you use the controls on the steering wheel. Same thing with adjusting the steering wheel. Use the buttons on the steering wheel to adjust that. Head-up display, same sort of thing there, but you have to dig through this software first. And digging through this software, it's just not as intuitive maybe for me as I might like. I found myself constantly hunting for the right option in a way that I don't in a Rivian or in a Tesla, even though I don't drive those any more often than I do these. Over here on the assistant systems, again, lane keeping off, lane keeping on, it has been acting up a little bit. On the drive section, this is where we can raise the suspension and you can adjust all the various key things. Steering feel, suspension feel, one pedal drive, power delivery. There is no dedicated sport mode. Closest thing we get here is sport mode for the stability and traction control, but that's not really an all-encompassing sport mode. If you're in drive, we do, however, have a direct access button to the performance mode, which is a nice touch, and a direct access button to the two different levels of one-pedal driving. Now, on the navigation software, this has had lots and lots of updates over time. So for instance, if I were to try and navigate to this hotel where I was driving the Lexus LX Hybrid recently, it's automatically going to know that we need to charge. It's going to pick an appropriate charging stop. It's going to tell you how long you need to spend there. And when you're charging over here, it's going to tell you when you're done with that charging stop, how charged to get. It's a really great thing, and it works incredibly well. It also will take you to Tesla supercharger stations. It's going to take you to where it finds the best and most reliable charging for your particular situation. And it integrates lots of crowdsourced information, not just from the Google Maps operators, but also from Waze. So it's actually aggregating all that together and the range predictions have been very, very accurate. Like many modern EVs, you can see the screen sort of floats over the lower portion of the dashboard. We have a storage bin under there, and then this center portion of the console floats on top of that storage bin. But we don't have a completely flat floor like we find in some EVs. I don't really find that to be too much of a problem because I do like my cargo or whatever there to be held and not rolling into the footwell. But you'll notice if you look closer that this could be a lot bigger. There's actually a pretty substantial hump right there. Whether that is some sort of vestigial driveline hump from SPA 1, I cannot say, but you know, I do have my suspicions. Over here we have some USB-C charge points, a little holder for your smartphone or your whatever, that's just what that is. Moving over here, we have the RFID card reader and the Qi wireless charge mat. Yep, RFID cards because you can use a proximity key or RFID cards or phone as key eventually in the Polestar 3 to start the car. We do have a power volume knob, play, pause there. That's a nice touch. And it does toggle side to side for track forward, backward. We have two big cup holders in the middle, but this whole area has lots of piano black. I think I would rather have had more of that open pore wood because this is going to show scratches a lot more easily. Back here we have a padded center armrest, pretty decently sized storage area given the general dimensions of this and the fact that we have three-zone climate control. So there's a separate climate control zone and air vents back there. That's why that storage cubby is not quite as big as you might otherwise think. Now over on the driver's side, well actually let's stop by the middle of the dashboard first. We have the Bowers & Wilkins center channel speaker there, part of the driver monitoring system you can see there. Over here we have the head-up display. Again, very horizontal, really nicely done dashboard. I like all the stitch work, etc. We have a separate instrument cluster here, something that I do appreciate, even though this is on the small side. I think it gives you all the basics and importantly, still gives you full screen mapping. That's a really nice touch. I like how Polestar has kept that in this car rather than just giving you the center screen like we find in the EX30. One interesting touch, these are touch buttons, but they're not illuminated or anything like that at night. So no buttons or little LCDs that change tell you what to do. Instead, you will know what to do by that instrument cluster there. So you touch the option, that's how you're gonna tell what's going on there. Currently, these buttons don't do anything at the moment. It's a round sport steering wheel design, decently sized sport grips, leather wrapped of course, and I think that the wheel design is actually quite attractive. If I go over to this side to show you the close-up, more wood trim over there, and then we have fabric here for the speaker grills that are integrated into the door. That brings us along to my last complaint, which is the window switch situation on the driver's door. That's the release for the door itself. These are the only window switches you get. So right now, this is the front window. But if I want the rear window, I press this touch button in the middle. You'll see that it's now illuminated to indicate that the rear windows are the ones you're gonna get, although that upper LED is still pretty bright, so at night sometimes it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on. We then have the touch switch module here for the door locks, and what's interesting is that this is a physical button module and a touch sensitive display on top, so it knows what you've done based on where you've clicked, but the whole module itself clicks. And then we have these LEDs that don't just flash, they fade from one to the other, and they turn green or they turn orange, etc. Why am I pointing those small details out? Well, because according to some suppliers that are not involved in the Volvo supply chain, mind you, they believe that this button module is actually more expensive than just giving us 4 window switches. So this is entirely a style decision, not driven by cost cutting, but it's one that makes 0 sense to me. Since this is an EV, the first thing we need to do is talk about performance. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 4 seconds, even if you're in the performance mode. That is significantly quicker than Polestar's claim. And it's worth noting, notably faster than when I first tested one out in Spain. Actually about 0.8 of a second faster. That was at 90% state of charge. At 40% state of charge, 4.2 seconds, 0 to 60. Seems that below 50% state of charge, things do drop just a little bit down, but it was very consistent from that point on until about 15% state of charge, where the vehicle started warning that performance was getting reduced a little bit, but still pretty darn quick. And again, notably faster than the last one that I tested and faster than Polestar's claim. If you are looking at a performance package version, you can actually go 0 to 60 now in under 4 seconds. So Polestar has been dialing up the performance just as they had promised. 60 to 0 stopping distance, that's nothing short of fantastic thanks to the wide tires. This model Summer tires at 38 degrees Fahrenheit when we were testing this morning, just 103 feet from 60 back to 0. This stops practically on a dime, even though it weighs about 5,600 pounds. Now, on the other hand, that is lighter than something like a Cadillac Lyriq, and these brakes have really great bite to them. I don't think I have anything that'll fly around in the car, but just romping on the brakes, very instant grab. You do get a lot of ABS actuation, but this stops very, very quickly. And this is capable of repeated 60 to 0, 0 to 60 runs. You can just keep romping on the pedals, and it's not going to start reducing performance until you've done that about 8 or 9 times, 60 to 0, 0 to 60, etc. You then do start to see some sort of reduction. The other thing I didn't notice when I was driving this out in Spain is just how well dialed in the chassis is. A lot of EVs are capable of really insane 0 to 60 times, and Polestar is certainly dialing that in on the 3. But what this has baked into the DNA is just a really well-designed suspension and that really well-honed torque vectoring axle. You can really feel it in the corners there, really having a yaw motion on the vehicle that you just don't see in a Model X or a Model Y, outside, of course, of the tri-motor models, which are going to be more expensive than this. There are plenty of EVs that are quick 0 to 60, and a decent number that can also stop really rapidly as well. But few have the level of suspension and just dynamic polish that we find in this 3. And that is the most interesting thing, the thing that I didn't quite realize when I was driving this in Spain. I was not on roads I was familiar with, but here on these roads, this is just all kinds of fantastic. The level of grip that we find here is insane. Now, we don't have access to a skid pad or a track where we can do a figure 8, but I know folks that do, and this actually outperforms the BMW, the Mercedes, and the tri-motor Audi when it comes to both the skid pad and the figure 8. It also outperforms the Model X and the Model Y. Now, this doesn't grip the road like a Porsche Cayenne, but it's 800 pounds heavier. It's worth noting, though, that it is lighter than a Cadillac Lyriq, the top-end versions of the Lyriq. On tighter roads like this, it really feels like it weighs a lot less, though, because that torque vectoring axle is just all in its own here. You can really feel it steering you around these corners. This is nothing like a Volvo EX90, even though the EX90 actually shares the same torque vectoring rear axle tech. It's just been tuned to a very different feel in the Polestar 3. This is insane. This drives like a BMW iX wishes it could drive. And that's not something that I thought I would say about the Polestar 3. Now, when it comes to the handling score, clearly I'm going to have to give this an A, bearing in mind that we don't yet have that Porsche alternative. When we do, things could be different. Also, though, we don't yet have the Cadillac Lyriq V, and that is something I'm really interested to see, because Cadillac has been doing a really good job at making their vehicles handle like they're on rails, if we're talking about their rear-wheel drive models. And the Lyriq V has a little bit of that promise, only in electric form. So really intrigued to see what exactly Cadillac has cooked up. Just keep in mind, it is going to be heavier than this Polestar. This Polestar has a lot of aluminum construction going on up front, but most of the rear is steel. So that's probably why the curb weight is as it is. And again, there's that relation to the SPA 1 platform. Every dual motor model gets the adaptive air suspension system standard, and there are 3 settings: standard, nimble, and firm. Standard is not floaty-boaty by any means, but it is a solid commuter level of suspension. One thing you'll notice, there's not a lot of body roll, not a lot of tip and dive as you find in some air suspension vehicles. So that has also been dialed in. And if you want to take things just a little bit further, you could get the performance tuned suspension in the performance pack model. It's not a world of difference. We're talking shades of gray here, but if you want that next level of ability, it is available there. As far as comparisons go, I would say that this suspension generally is firmer than the one in the BMW iX, firmer than the one in the EQE SUVs that we've tested, still firmer than the Audi SQ8. It's not harsh by any means, because we're talking about a segment of very grown-up performance vehicles, so this has a great balance to it, but it is firmer than those other options. So I'm going to give ride quality a B. When it comes to cabin noise, this surprised me a bit due to the wide tires that we have. 68.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, meaning this is a pretty quiet cabin for this category. I will note, though, however, that over about 75 miles an hour, we do get a little bit of a whistle somewhere around here, perhaps due to the eccentric shape of those side view mirrors. So at higher speeds, it is going to be just a little bit louder than some of the competition, but at average driving speeds, this is actually one of the quietest. It can also be one of the more efficient, depending on how you're driving it and depending on what you're considering competition. If we're talking about a Macan EV, it's not overly efficient. Neither is this. We're talking MPGEs under 100 for all of these models. Earlier in the week, I had to drive to Napa. It was about a 5-hour round trip. Driving gently in one direction, I averaged 3.2 miles per kilowatt hour, putting this actually above the EPA specification in terms of its efficiency and its range. But the other direction, I drove more keeping up with traffic, more in the left lane, and then I averaged about 2.6 miles per kilowatt hour, putting the real world range of this somewhere between 270, maybe 340 miles, depending exactly how you're driving it. If you keep speeds at 60 or below, you're gonna get really solid range. If you start driving 70 or 80 miles an hour, you drive it like you stole it, you're gonna get much lower range. Now, that little ding dong we should talk about, because this has all of Volvo's active safety systems basically on it. And the tuning of these active safety systems is more like Volvo than like BMW. So even though I didn't really cross that lane line very much, we got the lane line departure alert. And then there's what I talked about earlier, which is that the software is not fully baked. So even though I have the lane warning system turned off, it still will occasionally warn me.
Before we talk about pricing, it's time for a few shameless plugs. If you haven't found us over on the EV Buyer's Guide channel, be sure and subscribe there now. If you haven't found the podcast, be sure and follow that on your favorite podcasting platforms and subscribe to that YouTube channel so you can actually see our smiling faces while we're talking as well. And then if that wasn't enough, the really devoted fans can head over to the merch store where you can find merch like this minivan t-shirt or charging plug merch right like that shirt there where we have some charging plugs. Anyway, let's dive into the pricing now. Well, no, I tell a lie. Let's have an update first, because I should let everybody know that because of the problems we had with the infotainment screen and my questions around some of the software updates, which seemingly should have applied to our Polestar 3, or the one we were testing, I reached out to Polestar and they confirmed that I was driving an early pre-production model, and for some reason it could not get the software updates. And that meant that the car that I was driving was a few versions behind. Most notably, the one I had did not support the digital key for iOS and Android devices, which is currently available, and it did not support wireless CarPlay, which is also currently available. So if you have a Polestar 3 today, you should have those features. If you have a Polestar and you're watching this video, a Polestar 3, and for some reason you're having issues, obviously let us know down there in the comment section below, because we really want to hear from you. And you can also, of course, reach out to us via the other methods. hey@autobuyersguide.com. You can leave us voice memos and voice messages, etc. there as well. The last disclaimer here is on the legroom figures. I double, triple checked with Polestar. They tell me that their legroom figures are accurate, but they're giving me European legroom measurements and converting them to inches. So when we take a look at those numbers and then we take a look at our internal measurements here, where we literally measured a Chevy Blazer EV and then the Polestar 3 EV side by side, it appears that the Polestar 3 is about 5 to 6 inches larger than the numbers would indicate. So legroom is much more similar, I should say, to Blazer and Lyriq than to some of the smaller two-row EVs. Big thing to keep in mind. You might be thinking to yourself, why is the Polestar 3 so big, but inside it's so small? I'm pretty sure that those numbers are wrong. With that out of the way, let's dive into pricing. If you want the 350-mile long-range rear-wheel drive version of the Polestar 3, that's the cheapest, $68,900. Then we step up into the long-range all-wheel drive model I had, $74,800. But the one that I had the larger tire package, which actually should have reduced its EPA range down to 279 miles. There was also a little bit of confusion on that front there. If you want the performance trim, that's $80,800 starting, and you'll end up at around $93,400 fully loaded. That's a very similar pricing range to the Cadillac Lyriq, not too far off where we find the Tesla Model X. Keep in mind the Model X has become more expensive and it no longer qualifies for any federal tax treatment. The Audi Q8 has been discontinued, so the numbers you see on your screen are 2024 numbers, and it's right there in line with everything from the ZDX to the EX90, etc. Let's talk about some of the competition now. Obviously, we need to talk about the Tesla, but that would be the Model X, not the Model Y, because dimensionally and stylistically, this is more X than Y. The Y is much firmer, it is simpler, it's not quite as luxurious as the Polestar 3. The Model X really is the Polestar 3 counterpoint, I would say. And bear in mind, Model X starts as a 2-row vehicle, the third row is optional. I guess you could say the third row is optional of Polestar 3 as well. That would be the EX90. At any rate, the Model X is a lot faster in the top-end versions. It's definitely more tech-forward in some ways because of Tesla's more frequent software updates. Polestar could be delivering the kind of software updates we see from Tesla. They just choose to be a little bit slower on that front. There's also the bonkers plaid model on the Model X, but we don't know exactly what the future has in store for the Polestar 3. The Cadillac Lyriq is obviously a strong contender here because it was the best seller in this particular segment in 2024, the supposed mid-size luxury 2-row EV segment, as tiny as that sounds. The Lyriq gets a slightly shorter range. We get slightly better performance in the brand new V. Stay tuned because hopefully I'll be driving that soon. But the V trim is more expensive, and that's the part that surprised me. The Lyriq may start less, and admittedly, I think you get less in that Lyriq in the base form, but the Lyriq V does get pretty darn expensive, up over $100,000, and that's quite a bit more than the price tag on the Polestar 3. I think I would get a Polestar 3. I think it's more unique looking. I think it's a bit more comfortable than the Lyriq, especially the seats. The seats in the Lyriq are not my favorite. I haven't tested out the Lyriq V seats, however, so stay tuned for that one. And the Lyriq also feels pretty heavy, and indeed it is pretty heavy just due to its design. Whether or not the long-term ability of that battery and battery module system to be replaced easily in the future and maintained actually matters, we don't know because battery replacement's pretty rare in an EV. So, stay tuned on that one as well. Next up, we have the Mercedes-Benz EQE, specifically the EQE SUV. This is sort of egg-shaped luxury. I love the infotainment system. I think that the Mercedes software is extraordinarily convoluted, but I love its feature set and I love the look. I also think that Mercedes has overdone themselves when it comes to just all the luxury doodads you can add to an EQE. Unfortunately, that's why it gets pretty darn expensive, up to nearly $140,000. Clearly, we can't talk about a luxury EV in this space without talking about a Porsche, however. And the Macan, I guess we should talk about the Macan EV here because that is the one that we have now. But in a weird sort of way, I think the Polestar 3 was more targeted at a future Cayenne than the Macan. The Macan, I've only been able to drive it very briefly, but it is definitely on the firmer and sportier side compared to the Polestar 3, just as you'd expect between Cayenne and Macan. If, however, I were to compare this to a gasoline-powered Cayenne, I actually think the comparison makes an awful lot of sense. They drive actually somewhat like one another in the way the steering feels, in the way the turn-in feels, the way the handling feels out on the road. There is this interesting synergy that I had not exactly expected. Now, interior style, I think Porsche is really pushing the luxury side of their portfolio here when it comes to their SUVs and, of course, the Taycan, etc. The wood quality on modern Porsches is fantastic. The assembly quality, build quality is very, very good. I love the Polestar 3, but it's not quite where we see Porsche. And that's logically why the price tag is not quite where we see Porsche either. Next up, we have the BMW iX. This is BMW's boxy test bed for exotic materials. So it is not an all-aluminum SUV. It has a lot of carbon fiber construction in it, which is kind of cool. The downside to that appears to be higher insurance costs, which not everybody is considering. Apparently, the BMW iX is about 25% more to insure than a BMW X5, and that kind of makes sense because of its carbon fiber reinforced construction. I also like some of BMW's electric innovations, like their brushed motor design, which lets you actually change the magnetic field properties of the rotor in the motor. I'll let you Google and see what I'm talking about there, but it's pretty darn cool. Also, the range is definitely solid, but it's pretty darn expensive. A lot less expensive and more in line with the price tag here is the Acura ZDX. Basically, Lyriq perfected. And in some ways, I think the ZDX is more like the Polestar 3 than the Lyriq is because we get the adaptive air suspension, which we don't find on the regular Lyriq. And size-wise, they're pretty darn similar. The style, that I'm not the biggest fan of, but there's another odd synergy, and that is this Cadillac connection. And that means, of course, we also have to talk about the Volvo EX90 because that is the close relative of the Polestar 3. And in some ways, the way to look at this is if you want a 3-row Polestar 3, that's the EX90. If you want a 2-row EX90, that's the Polestar 3. But there's a bit more going on than just that. They obviously have changed the exterior style a lot. So the Polestar 3 is more low-slung. It has that really low hood line, which yields a less practical cargo area under the hood, of course. We get a rearranged cargo area in the back, but a lot of the same components are at play. We get very similar power output figures in these models. They use basically the same motors and same battery packs, etc. If you need a 3rd row, obviously EX90 is the way to go. Also, if you want something that's a little bit less sporty, go for the Volvo. Admittedly, there's not as much of a difference as you might think, though, because there is certainly some Polestar DNA infused into the structure of the vehicle and the motors and everything that goes into it. So the EX90 is probably one of the most dynamic Volvos in quite some time. It's certainly one of the most powerful in known memory, 500 horsepower plus in that model. But it is tuned towards the softer side of things when it comes to the suspension and the options. And it doesn't have a top speed quite as fast. You can't get yellow seat belts, things like that. And intrinsically, the bigger difference is in styling. But then, my bottom line with Polestar has long been, I don't totally understand why it exists. I'm glad that it does, don't get me wrong. I'm glad that we have a Polestar out there. I just honestly think that the money might have been better spent if every Polestar model that we see so far still existed, but had a Volvo logo on it and was sold at the Volvo dealer. I know that's controversial to the Polestar people, but you know what? This could have been a 2-row EX90 Sport. It would have been just fine. It could have been the Polestar EX90. I don't know. Sub-brand made more sense in my head than a separate brand, but I'm not the one in charge of such matters. So let me know what you think about that down there, and let me know what you think about the Polestar 3. I have to admit that since babies are on their way, I am starting to look at EVs with a lot more legroom in the back, because that we'd be able to fit a rear-facing child seat behind me as a driver, and Polestar 3 is in solid contention because it is one of the roomier options. Let me know what you think about that too. See all of you later.